So one more good afternoon, everyone. I do this with our students. We're going to try that again just to get energy in the room. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I love that. And welcome home to everyone. Welcome home. Welcome to the Centennial Speaker Series, CA's Mission in Motion. Many of the folks in the room may not have been back in years. Alums, parents of alums, former faculty and staff, or as I like to say, staffalty. Others experience CA today as students and parents. Things may be different. Schools are always evolving, but the consistent connection across everyone here today is that CA's values remain the same now as they were 100 years ago. The school culture has always cultivated a responsibility for citizenship, respect for the individual, while balancing an appreciation for community, love of learning, and common trust. These are at the heart of Concord Academy. Over the next few hours, you will hear from CA alums who embodied these values, from authors, scientists, activists, creatives, journalists, educators, and more. We are asking that you all re-engage with the impetus and energy that ignited you when you were here as students or through your first experiences with CA. We hope you will lean into these conversations, and whether soon or long after you leave this weekend, there will be moments in life that you reflect and know that CA is a catalyst for how you want to make the most of your life. It is with great honor and privilege that I introduced our opening session, The Power of Personal Stories. Moderator, Lucille Stott, is a beloved former faculty member and has served many capacities for CA over the years. Most recently, as the author of Centennial's book, Concord at 100, Voices from the First Century. In the book, Lucille writes, quote, graduates interviewed for this book often answered with a question by asking something like, I can't find exactly the right words to tell you what I mean, but let me tell you a story. There is no one better to guide this first panel. I encourage you to stop by the welcome tent and pick up a copy of the book if you haven't already. And so without further ado, Lucille.
Thank you, Henry. Is this okay? Can everyone hear all right? Okay. I wanted to start off just very briefly giving a shout out to the chair of Concord Academy's Visual Arts Department, Monica Ripley. Recently, she was asked what her favorite tradition at Concord Academy was, and she said this, my favorite Concord Academy tradition is chapel. It is a daily reminder that each of us holds a valid, beautiful story worth telling. And I think we've all, or most of us in any case, who've been here since 1956, understand that sentiment. And so I'm very honored to be with three wonderful storytellers who've told many, many beautiful tales. And so we're going to launch right in. We don't have too much time, but I wanted to know, I don't know who wants to start off, but sort of when did you first, or when was a moment when you can think of that you felt the impact, the power of a story? Anyone want to start? Mr. David.
Oh, boy. Thanks. Well, look, first of all, thank you for re-engaging me with the story of Concord. I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for you, Lucille. You brought us all together in a symphony of voices in an extraordinary book that I was amazed that you had found as many voices as you did and as many stories were, and that they harmonized, and that the decades went by and yet we still were in the same place with the same values, and it was the emblem of how storytelling is about values and is about the core. And I really appreciated your including me, so thanks. I think for me, I'm going to go back to a book because it always starts with reading. And it was a book that was written by a neighbor of mine in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was a 14-year-old kid. I was clueless. I was conceited. I thought I knew things, but I didn't know anything. I picked up this book, and what I knew about it, and only vaguely, was that it had been written by a man who had ended his own life. And so there was an incompletion to the life of the author, and it was a biography of Scott Fitzgerald. And the author's name was Andrew Turnbull, and I took it with me on a summer trip in France. I was in a barge reading this book, and all I knew when I finished reading this book was that there was something unbelievably incomplete about this life, and it left somehow space and room to imagine and dream that the life of a writer was a life that could be somehow picked up, that you could continue. And I used to go to movies with my mother, who was incorrigibly late and not organized, and did not mind at all that The Sound of Music or The King of Hearts, which played for about 52 years at Central Square Theater, was starting at 9 o'clock. We would just go in the middle of the movie, and you could do that in those days. And there was something about encountering a story that was in progress, that was challenging, both to figure out why, how, what, all the things that you had to figure out. And then it all came, and then you stayed, the movie ended, you stayed in the interval, and then you started watching it all over again. This was a storytelling skill that turned out to be incredibly useful for biography. The second thing was I slept over at people's houses because my parents were divorced, and my own house was a sort of absent of certain things, laughter, and certain other things that at the time I needed. And I found other things in other houses, but the experience of being a sleepover artist meant that I learned how to listen to people's voices in other families and understand that there were certain secrets, or there were certain taboos, or there were certain traditions that were kept or couldn't be told to Aunt Sally but had to be kept from Aunt Sally. Or it was a sort of instant ambassadorship to family and to the community of family. Then finally, it was for me a moment of realizing that I loved the life story. And it was every time I picked up a biography, the thing that I got from it, it wasn't just another form of a Charles Dickens or 19th century novel. It was that you saw many versions of the same person. We're all so many versions. I think it's the one form, and it's why I've remained committed to it. Biography can contain all of the Eleanors. It can contain all of the Davids. And I don't have to be present at all. And I have to be somehow available everywhere. And it's the crux of that when a man's life, I think in the cases I've studied, which is N.C. Wyeth and Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, their lives expanded with their work and reached peaks of power and communication and even universality. But then their lives narrowed. And what I discovered with Eleanor Roosevelt was that her life just kept opening. And her life started at 36, and she had lived her entire life, 78 years, 1884, 1962. We were not a multiracial democracy in this country. She never experienced a multiracial democracy. She simply worked to expand for one. And it wasn't until she was 36 that she even began to glimpse that women might have power and that there might be some inclusion on that score in 1920 when women began to vote. But Eleanor's life was always about including and finding ways to expand democracy and expand her own understanding. She transcended her own life's pain, which was grim. She was a reader, she was a writer, she was so many things. What she was above all was somebody who found her humanity in others. And it's that idea of Ubuntu where she was humane and empathic, because she could find herself in other people. And that's, to me, that was the lesson of Concord Academy. That's the lesson of life stories, is that you are who you are because of who everybody is.
Yeah, great, great. I remember you saying that Eleanor... David said once that Eleanor would have made a wonderful Concord Academy student. I think that's probably true. Who would like to?
Imani, you go.
Sure. Go ahead.
So let me tell you a story. There was one afternoon, my junior year, when Mrs. Eisendrath ran up to me. She was crying, and so I started crying. And she said, "I need to talk to you because you're the only person who understands what it means to be homesick wherever you are." And for some reason, she's a person who saw the sort of the ever-present yearning for home that I lived with. And for me, even though I came here at 5 years old, home always meant Birmingham. And that is in some ways, so I say that because that's part of and I'm guessing she saw that because I tell stories of home all the time. And that was so much a part of my family culture, a kind of recursiveness with a sort of repetition of stories that were part of our self-definition. My mother sustained that all the time we were here, so I was constantly living with stories from my early childhood, stories from her childhood, and then I would go home and my grandmother would tell me stories from her childhood and stories from before, and my great-grandmother. So that the sort of the idea, the sort of anchoring oneself in the world through the repetition of stories, the same stories, right, was present from quite an early age. And then there was something, so the sort of telling stories, I didn't actually feel very capable as a writer of stories until taking writing seminar here with Mr. McFarland. And he introduced me to Richard Wright's Black Boy, and I read this text through school, in graduate school and the like, but he's the only person who had me read it and said, pay attention to the sentences and the composition and sort of the description, not just of the unbelievable violence of the environment, but the incredible beauty of the environment. I tell this, I didn't realize that Mr. McFarland was also from Birmingham, and actually I thought because of the way he spoke that he was from Virginia. He's so eloquent. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. So in many ways, here is where I sort of experienced the transition from sort of a deep association with storytelling as the sort of way you live to storytelling as sort of what you do in a textual form.
Stories for me really were the way I began to imagine what kind of future I might be able to forge at a time when little girls in Virginia, where I grew up in the 1950s, were not meant to do much of anything and were meant to continue their lives in the segregated society that Virginia then was. And so we think today so often about role models and how important it is for young people to have role models. I had no role models who had done anything other than raise children, and that's what my mother and all her social circle had done. And so for me to be able to imagine something beyond that and to imagine a different kind of world, it had to happen in books. And so it was really stories, I think, that saved me. And I can think of several kinds of stories that for me became inspirations to want to tell my own story and write my own story, both metaphorically and literally. One of those was Nancy Drew, who may be familiar and beloved by many of you. And she seemed to not need anyone else in the world. She had this boyfriend who was no more an accessory than her blue Roadster. I think the Roadster was more important. She'd say to her father, "You let me do whatever I want. I love you so much, Daddy." That seemed ideal to me. And then she went out and solved problems by doing, she could change a tire, fix an engine, sail a boat, decipher cryptography. She could do everything. And by the end of the book, justice had been established. And that just seemed to be miraculous. Now, I am not alone, in my generation in particular, of people who were inspired by Nancy Drew. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, Hillary Clinton was, Oprah, it goes on and on. The most unimaginable sort of combination of people who found this inspiring. There were other stories as well. Anne Frank was inspiring to me because of how she built a life for herself through writing and reflection and was so reflective about herself. But it was really books and the privilege of being able to delve into so many different stories that made me think, okay, I need to write my own story, and I'm going to do it in my life, and I'm going to try to do it so others can read something that maybe will give them the possibility of imagining something about the world in which they want to live.
It's interesting because one of the things that Drew wrote, one of your first books published in 1992, Southern Stories, it's a collection of wonderful essays from the South. She said, we live within the stories we tell. And for me, that changed completely the way I look at stories. I always thought of stories that we carry the stories within us. And she is saying we live within our stories. And so I'm wondering about how you found the stories that you wanted to tell. You were talking about being present with Eleanor in her biography. And I'm wondering how you chose the stories that you wanted to dwell in.
There's a German philosopher named Herder who writes about history, and he says one of the things that's so important is not just to live, for a historian, is not just to live in history, but to live in its strangeness. And that takes another dimension. And I've always thought that the subjects that have come to me because my strangeness somehow matches the strangeness of the subject, and there's some way in. And with Eleanor, I absolutely had a definite idea that I did not want to write access biography anymore, meaning I didn't want anybody to be the gatekeeper. I wanted to be close to her. I didn't want a child or a grandchild or a widow or a widower to tell me what I could and couldn't do, what I could and couldn't see. And Eleanor, God bless her, she left everything. You and I and we all can go and read and write a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt because she left all her papers to the American people. And there they were, which is just the beginning, of course. But it was a platform, and I knew that meant that I could get as close to her as my ability to get was going to work out. I had a moment, though, where, there's always a good reason, there was a good publishing reason, there had not been a one-volume biography for years, etc. But the real reason was that I went and had to clear out a safe deposit box in Washington, D.C. Riggs Bank, the one with the big gold dome on Massachusetts, M Street and Wisconsin Avenue was closing. I went in and I started clearing everything out of it. It was a deep box that my mother had when she lived in Washington, D.C., and I just had not ever stopped paying it, and now it was done. And my mother was an inveterate beginner of memoirs and plays and screenplays, and they all last exactly one page. They're all on yellow pads, and they all last one page. But this particular was a memoir of her life with Mrs. Roosevelt as the producer, the one woman on the last television show that Eleanor Roosevelt did at WGBH, which was broadcast out of Brandeis. And my mother's job, among other things, she had to help Mrs. Roosevelt choose her dress for the monthly program, which meant going to a closet in New York and choosing one of four sort of what she called them wash day dresses, sort of taking the least, the least elastic of them and choosing that one. She had to brief her on the guests and do this and that. The most important thing was that right before the show, Eleanor Roosevelt had to take a nap because she was very near the end of her life and she was losing energy, and she would tend to fall asleep during little cat naps during the show. So the nap helped, but the nap was when she napped, like Churchill, she napped deep. And my mother's job was to go in, and she described in this, as I'm in the Riggs Bank, it looks like, this, it's carpeted and it's quiet, and I'm reading with unbelievable fascination that my mother would go into the room and put her hand on Eleanor Roosevelt's shoulder to just jostle her awake. She said she just couldn't bear doing it, because what would happen as the hand came close to her shoulder was a sense of what my mother described as mana, a kind of energy force of just her energy was present in her napping. She felt that there was something going on with Mrs. Roosevelt as she napped that she just didn't want to disturb. And the minute she would put her hand on it, a kind of electrical current would just jolt everybody, and Eleanor would wake up, and everything, that the moment had now been lost. And she said, and I really think that this explains Eleanor Roosevelt in a very particular way, which is that, and then ... And, yeah, Ma? What is it? And that was the moment where I thought, well, someone's got to finish this book. And so...
I choose stories that I think need to be told, and I'm sort of struggling with why they haven't been told yet. So, for example, when I wrote a history of the song that's known as the Black National Anthem, which has now come into the public sphere for a variety of reasons, the NFL, what have you, but when I started the book, was not just not in the public arena much, but was actually becoming less well known in Black communities, particularly for younger people. I was sort of astonished that there wasn't a book about this song that had a 100-year history, that was called the Negro National Hymn or the Negro National Anthem before the United States had declared a national anthem. And so I said, oh, well, this needs to be written because it's really important. And so one piece was, and then I heard that someone was writing a book about it, and so I was like, okay, well, I won't write it. And then I set it aside, and then I read the book, and I was like, I don't really like the way they told the story, so I'm gonna do it. But then the other piece is that I'm always trying, for me, each book is sort of a problem that I'm trying to solve, right? So this was, how do you write a biography of a song? And how do you write a biography of a song that's not just about the composer and the lyricist, but it's actually about how people take up, how people live with the song. And so that became, building an archive of sorts, right, of all of the school programs and all of the ceremonies and all of the novels that reference it and memoirs, and just sort of try to cobble together a collective story. I think similarly with writing a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, whose A Raisin in the Sun is probably the most widely produced play by a Black woman in history, and yet people didn't even, when I was working on it, they were concerned that if I just said it was a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, people wouldn't know who it was about, right? Her name, she didn't have name recognition the way that the play did. And so it was sort of this feeling, well, this is this incredibly important figure for me personally, but also I think for them, here's a woman who identified very clearly as a lesbian, but hadn't been written. Her history vis-a-vis her sexuality had not been written. She identified as a feminist before the feminist movement so she was and she was a radical leftist, and so she was someone who spoke to the present time, but was relatively invisible. So that was the sort of the gap that I felt needed to be filled, is to tell her story. But then also the problem was, how to tell this story of a person who passed at a very young age, who most of her writing had not been published, so how do you tell a story about what she wrote about without people being able to read it? And so it was a problem to fit, and so that's part of what drives my curiosity, is sort of the intellectual exercise of sort of how do you figure out how to tell stories in a kind of, to be resourceful and to be creative, and also to sort of to adequately, or to try to sort of do justice to the subject matter. Yeah.
when I think of how to categorize the stories that I've written about, I would say that the great bulk of them have been really about how human beings can be so terrible to one another. And that began with a number of books about the antebellum South and whites in the antebellum South in particular, and then moving into the Confederate war years of how people managed basically just to get up in the morning and justify to themselves the world in which they lived. I'm sure that came in no small part from growing up in a segregated white society in Virginia and wondering how everyone around me as I was a child had come to accept this society that, thank God, was beginning to change, but had not yet when I was a child. And then I wrote a book about death and the Civil War. How could people kill each other? How could they slaughter one another the way they did? And what compromises do we make with ourselves? What stories do we tell ourselves to enable these kinds of inhumanities? But I've now written a book that's different. It's a memoir. It'll be coming out in the summer, and it's really motivated by age, I think, in large part. I realize sitting here with all of you and looking out at the room, I represent the first half of Concord's century. I graduated in 1964, so I'm the old guard in that way. But I also am the old guard in that I lived in a world that is fast disappearing, and people who remember that world are fast disappearing. And I felt it has not been understood well. And having been a historian and listening to people all these years, I wanted now to tell. And so I've written about growing up, stops when I turned 21, but growing up in that Virginia society that I described, and then coming into a world that was rapidly changing and not changing, and how that opened things for me and enabled me to have opportunities and to live a life that my mother or grandmothers could never have experienced. So it's not about, I hope it's not about how was I so terrible, since I said all my other books were about how people were so terrible. That's not certainly my intention, but really, how was my life made possible by the kind of change that so often is being denied now? Nothing's changed, nothing's better. Believe me, if I dropped you into Virginia in 1950, you'd think that things had changed and things had gotten better. And I wanted to tell that story.
It's exciting to know. Drew's book can be pre-ordered on Amazon, by the way, and there is a. She promised me there's a full chapter on Concord Academy in it, so I'm very eager to read it.
Can I say one thing? Concord Academy freed me. This school was the absolute essential for my having been able to live the kind of life that I've been blessed to lead. And it was here that I was freed from the kinds of constraints that I was struggling to find a way out of. So thank you, Concord Academy.
In Imani's latest book, South to America, which happened to win the 2022 National Book Award, she mentioned in the introduction, this is not a history, but this is a true story. And that really meant a lot to me because I felt that the best way to tell Concord Academy story, history was through stories. But often people think of history and story as two separate things. And history is a bunch of facts. And all of you, in all of the works that you've written, have brought a lot of voices into the stories into the real histories, biographies, real life things are happening, but you've brought a lot of voices, many of them new voices, into the writing. And so I wanted to sort of talk to you a little bit about where history and story intersect.
I'd love to hear Imani say a little more about her comment from the book.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking at that moment really about having been trained in history, like methodologically, and understanding as a discipline that, you sort of organize your evidence in a way that allows you to enter into a conversation with previous historians and sort of engage in a narration of the past, right? That I didn't have that kind of discipline, right? That I was trying to get at something a little bit, I was trying to get at a tapestry that wasn't necessarily, well, I'll say it this way. So last week I was in Little Rock, and I was walking the streets around where Central High was, the Central Park, the Central Little Rock 9, right, where the National Guard came in. And I was walking from a teacher's house who I was doing an oral history of Mrs. Abrams, a black teacher. So you walk the neighborhood, and there's these black schools, and you realize the proximity, right? It's incredibly close. So I thought, gosh, if I had, in Mrs. Abrams' house in 1957, you would have been able to hear the mob, right, yelling at the kids, right? And that sort of this question of how people could be so horrible to each other, how intimate it was, right? To try to get at that felt like something different than the way, when I wrote a book that was a more conventional history, or for example, I was, I use this example a lot to make the point. My grandmother used to, when we would have cereal, when she didn't make us, grits and eggs, we would have cereal in the morning, and she would always say, "Baby, put some more sugar on your cereal." Now, there's one account that would be about sort of, Southerners' addiction to sugar and but there's another that was about wanting to offer us some more sweetness in life, and a life that had a lot of bitterness. And I wanted to be able to tell stories that could get at that, right? Intimacy and cruelty, the desire for sweetness, the way that sugar could be an engine to keep you going, like these things that didn't fit into the way of telling, that I actually have a huge amount of respect for and value, but to the way you tell history in a formal sense, but that is about both the sense of the past, but also how it persists inside us.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
You have to go to Hyde Park, to the house of Franklin Roosevelt's mother, and see that there's a stool. And then in the same room, there's a very large sort of throne-like governor's chair, and next to that is a very large throne-like easy chair. And to know that Eleanor Roosevelt sat on that stool, that intimacy, that pain of being put into that position as a young woman over and over again. Go to Dealey Plaza, the intimacy of that setting. Barbara Tuchman says, walk the battlefield. What somebody can hear, that audio, when you know that you are closer to how painfully difficult something must have been in the intimacy of it, in the arrangement of it. That's the strangeness, I think, that Herder's talking about, and understanding it and living it and knowing that you are going to somehow explain it but never be able to understand it. You never quite understand the why of how people are so brutal to each other, which is, I took 10 years to write Eleanor Roosevelt, and I had the same experience of feeling, how could the 20th century have been this awful? And yet at the same time, because of taking 10 years, the book that I began writing in 2009, where I said to myself, sort of patting myself on the back, wow, you get to write about the longest serving First Lady of the United States while the first African-American president is in office. This is going to be fabulous. And then it was going to be, when the first female president, everything changed. And because of that, Eleanor popped up out of it like a action figure, like a pop-up. It was everything she'd fought for. If I'd said the word fascism in 2009, people would say, oh, well, yeah, but that's bad. No, now, sword in hand, she's at it. And she just changed. Everything about the book changed, and that it was luxury, that it was time, that I took the time, but it was also that history unfolding in real time meant that this history changed from under my hands. And I knew that there were whole paragraphs that had to be entirely redone because of it. And I felt so lucky that I got that moment of recognition, and I was able to see her utterly anew.
Your question made me think about a book that I think is assigned in to every high school student, so I think it'll be familiar to many of you. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carry, and how he writes about true war stories and what are true war stories, and how he insists on, I think, the higher truth of the story than what we might call the history, and how you can capture in a story a complexity that is not always available in a direct rendition of something in a more historic, sort of history-like way. So that sense of how do we use war stories and how they capture the chaos and try to make a sense of it that is not available to us until we insist on telling the story and using the story for our purposes.
Can I ask just a question that because one of the things we were talking about earlier about the way that we're in this conflict over what the national story will be, and I wonder if the story is actually the conflict, or is our story is the war, right? Over in that this sort of cyclical pattern of what are the values of the nation going to be is our story.
But it's fascinating to me, as you ask that question, I think, well, the effort is to shut down history so that we can't tell the true story.
At all, right.
And we're going to shut off parts of access to the past, certain kinds of writings about the past, in order that we can maintain our, in my view, fiction about what the nation is. So.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, if anyone would like to ask. I do see someone here, yeah? Do you need a...
I've pondered the issue of man's inhumanity to man as well. As a civil rights lawyer in Virginia, trying to bring some kind of decent health care to women incarcerated there. Excuse me. And in all the years of representing people convicted of crimes or accused of crimes, my only place of understanding is that if the environment in which those people are functioning allows and even condones the diminishment of another human being, it doesn't take us very long to degrade to the level of the permission that is granted. And so I imagine, and I can't know, but in the South, certainly in prisons in the South, permission is granted to despise those who are incarcerated. And the result of that is that those who are the keepers are fully justified in their eyes and then supported by their own community of keepers to behave as they do.
First, thank you for doing the work that you do.
Yes.
That's so important. But just as an observation about my own attitudes towards these questions, I find that in the last, 6, 8 years, I've really had to revise where I think the balance of human nature is. As I see our nation and others in the world beyond giving permission for certain kinds of behavior that permission was not given for in the years preceding, and watching people take that permission and being shocked that they do take that permission. So I think I was talking about being the elderly one or the old generation, I feel that I am moving through life now with a much darker view of human nature, with the bad part predominant and the good part having to be nurtured rather than the other way around. Depressing comment.
Other questions?
Hi, Nancy Cates, class of 1980. We're here in numbers, 1980. I make biographical films. First, I need to thank you. I've read books by all of you, so thank you so much, and thanks for this conversation. But I just had to jump in to say that, we strive to tell the truth in documentary, just as in history. But I'm the first person to tell you that it's a lie, or it's fiction, or that the idea of story in history is as much fiction as it is fact. I also made a film about Susan Sontag, who said that she preferred the form of truth that fiction provided over the one that is a nonfiction. So just want to throw that into the mix. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to say, I think that I often ask people, are you sure you want warts and all? Because it's creates a certain skew toward heroes. One of the first emails I got after writing a biography of Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, was an email that said, very simply, and it was back in 2007, so this world that we now live in was just the beginning. And it said, thanks for shitting on my childhood, asshole. I had worked hard. I had worked hard to get it right. But you can't disturb people from the stories they want sometimes, and they project onto figures like Schultz or Snoopy or Eleanor Roosevelt exactly what they want, and they see exactly what they want. And I agree, there's a distortion, and it worries me a lot, because when you tell a story, when you tell a life as a story, you are distorting it. You are choosing very, very carefully what parts of that life. You don't need to shrink away from the bad parts or the confusing, strange, or inconsistent parts. With Eleanor Roosevelt, anti-Semitism was very distinctly present in all of her correspondence in her early life for a number of years, and then she absolutely grew out of that. A number of other changes, dramatic ones, happened in her life. But it's that the story cannot contain all the stories, and so therefore it has to be the one that you're stuck with. And I often feel that when I speak or think about my own life. I'm sorry I'm stuck with this, but I am. And that's really what the artist or the biographer or the documentary filmmaker or historian has to contend with, is that you are stuck with the version you're going to choose. And you have to figure out, you have to take the time to choose in a way that is going to be representative, I think, and is going to allow the part of the person that transcended their own life to become clear. Because to me, that's the only part of the story that's true, ultimately, is not what you did with your life, but why your life was conducted by you the way it was. It's not the how or the what, it's why.
Thank you. So I'm a Gen X parent of a current CA student who is also the grandchild of a history professor. So my grandparents started their lives at the beginning of the 20th century, and I grew up with a real sense of history. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the challenges and the opportunities, pick whatever you like, in bringing history to life in a generation, the generation that has done high school in the pandemic, where it feels like so much of what we knew before almost doesn't apply to the world we're living in now, and yet without history and an understanding of how we got here, how do we live? So I'm interested in your take on the teaching, or even the passing on of history with the current generation. How do you see the challenges and the opportunities bringing that exercise to life? Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I'll give one example. I am one of those people who feels super excited about digitization and full text searching. And which, in part because the way that they can sort of organize information and collect information is really unbelievable. So my son recently did, as his final project for AP US History, was to do a documentary on the war on drugs and its relationship to mass incarceration, right? And the way that he could actually just pull articles, pull video, I mean, it's unbelievable. The challenge, I think, is actually, given that so many of us are not incredibly facile with it, is to sort of how do you discipline information in ways that are meaningful, right? And how do you develop this sort of muscle to sit down and read through things once you gather all of them together, right? So I think there is a lot of opportunity. I also have learned from my kids a lot about the sort of format of the video essay, where there are people who are actually reading very deeply and like synthesizing information and sharing. So I think that it's actually a really good time for history, and I think it's not incidental that a lot of works of history are really popular now, right? Nonfiction is really popular now, I think, because people are trying to make sense of the present by sort of tracing back. The last thing I'll say is just related to prison is after publishing South to America, I'm getting all of this mail, like archival material from people who did political work with my parents in the 60s and 70s, who are sending me like meeting minutes and various things that are basically showing me how sort of organizing around incarceration was really robust 20 years before everybody was talking about mass incarceration, right? So there's also, I think there's all these people who are waiting with materials ready to sort of respond to us. So I think the question is sort of how do we facilitate young people both organizing the material and finding a way to sort of, and giving them license to tell the story, right, with their skill set.
Does anyone have anything to add? I don't think, unfortunately, we have time for any more questions here, but I know that the authors are willing to speak with you out on the patio of the Stufac, which is just around the corner.